Good morning, beloved soul. As you open your eyes to this brand new day, I want you to know that this moment right here is no accident. You didn't stumble upon this message by chance. Heaven itself has orchestrated this divine appointment because there's something your heart desperately needs to hear today. Something that will change the entire trajectory of your morning, your day, and quite possibly your life. You see, I know exactly why you're here. I know that ache in your chest when you wake up feeling like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. I know about those 3 a.m. moments when sleep eludes you because your mind won't stop racing with worry, fear, and uncertainty. I know about the battles you're fighting in silence, the struggles you can't even put into words, and the deep longing in your spirit for something more than just surviving another day. But what if I told you that everything you've been searching for, everything your soul has been crying out for, can be found in just 3 simple words? 3 words that have the power to transform your darkest valley into a mountaintop experience. 3 words that can turn your mourning into dancing, your ashes into beauty, your despair into unshakable hope. Cover me with your grace, Lord. This isn't just another prayer. This isn't religious jargon or empty words we throw around in church. This is the desperate cry of a human heart that finally understands what it truly needs. And today we're going to dive deep into what it really means to be covered by God's grace, how to experience it in a tangible way, and why this single prayer can become the foundation for a life of unprecedented peace, joy, and victory. Now, before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. I need you to pause whatever you're doing and really listen. Not just with your ears, but with your heart. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't theoretical. This isn't some feel-good motivational speech. This is life-changing truth that has the power to heal your deepest wounds, break the chains that have held you captive, and launch you into the abundant life God has always intended for you. You know, there's a story I need to tell you, a story about a woman who woke up every single morning for 3 years feeling like she was drowning. She had all the external markers of success, a good job, a nice house, people who loved her, but inside she felt empty, broken, and completely overwhelmed by life. She would lay in bed each morning, staring at the ceiling, wondering how she was going to make it through another day. Sound familiar? Every morning she would force herself to get up, put on that brave face, and pretend like everything was fine. But deep down, she was crying out for something she couldn't even name. She tried everything: self-help books, meditation apps, therapy, new relationships, new jobs, new cities, but nothing filled that God-sized hole in her heart. Then one morning, something shifted. Instead of reaching for her phone to scroll through social media or check her emails, she did something different. She closed her eyes and whispered these words, "Cover me with your grace, Lord." She didn't even fully understand what she was asking for, but something in her spirit knew that this was exactly what she needed. And you know what happened? For the first time in years, she felt peace, not the kind of temporary relief you get from a distraction or a quick fix, but deep, soul-level peace that seemed to emanate from the very core of her being. It was as if a warm blanket of love had been wrapped around her wounded heart, and suddenly she could breathe again. That woman's story could be your story. That transformation could be your transformation. Because God's grace isn't reserved for the super spiritual or the seemingly perfect. It's available to anyone who has the courage to ask for it. But here's where most people miss it. They think grace is just about forgiveness. They think it's only about what happens when we mess up. But grace is so much bigger than that. Grace is God's unmerited favor actively working in your life right now. Grace is divine strength when you feel weak. Grace is supernatural peace in the middle of chaos. Grace is hope when everything looks hopeless. When you ask God to cover you with His grace, you're not just asking for a blessing. You're positioning yourself to receive divine intervention in every area of your life. You're opening the door for heaven to invade your circumstances and change everything that needs to be changed. Now, I want you to understand something crucial about this prayer. When we say, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," we're using biblical language that carries profound meaning. In Scripture, when God covers someone, it's always about protection, provision, and intimacy. When God covered Noah and his family in the ark, they were protected from the flood that destroyed the world. When God covered the Israelites with a cloud by day and fire by night, He was providing guidance and protection in the wilderness. But the most beautiful picture of God's covering comes from the book of Ruth. When Ruth went to Boaz in the middle of the night and asked him to spread his covering over her, she was asking for protection provision, and marriage. She was essentially saying, I want to be under your care, under your authority, under your love. And Boaz, who represents Christ in this beautiful love story, gladly extended his covering over her. This is what happens when you pray, "Cover me with your grace, Lord." You're positioning yourself under God's protective care. You're acknowledging that you need His strength, His wisdom, His provision, and His love. You're surrendering control and trusting Him to be everything you need. And here's the beautiful thing about God's grace. It's not something you have to earn. You don't have to clean up your act first. You don't have to get your life together before you can ask for it. Grace meets you exactly where you are, in all your messiness, in all your brokenness, in all your humanity. Think about it this way. When a mother covers her child with a blanket on a cold night, does the child have to do anything to deserve that covering? Of course not. The mother covers the child because she loves them, because she wants them to be warm and comfortable, because it's her nature as a loving parent to provide for her child's needs. That's exactly how God's grace works. He covers you because He loves you. He covers you because it's His nature as your Heavenly Father to care for you. He covers you not because of what you've done, but because of who He is. But here's what's really amazing about this prayer. When you consistently start your day by asking God to cover you with His grace, you begin to see His hand moving in ways you never noticed before. Doors start opening that were previously closed. Relationships begin to heal. Finances improve. Your health gets better. Your peace increases. Your joy returns. It's not magic. It's not some spiritual formula you can manipulate. It's simply the natural result of positioning yourself under God's covering and allowing His grace to flow freely in your life. I remember talking to a man who had been struggling with anxiety for over a decade. He had tried medication, therapy, lifestyle changes, everything he could think of. Nothing seemed to provide lasting relief. Then someone shared this prayer with him, and he decided to start each day by asking God to cover him with His grace. Within weeks, something began to shift. The anxiety didn't disappear overnight, but he noticed that he was handling stressful situations differently. He had more patience with his family. He was sleeping better. He felt more confident at work. And gradually, over the course of several months, the anxiety that had controlled his life for so long began to lose its grip. What changed? He positioned himself under God's covering, and grace began to do what grace does best, transform everything it touches. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, this sounds too good to be true. If God's grace is really this powerful, why do I still struggle? Why do I still face challenges? Why doesn't life just become easy? That's a fair question, and I want to address it head-on because understanding this is crucial to experiencing the full power of God's grace in your life. Grace doesn't eliminate all challenges from your life. What grace does is give you the supernatural ability to navigate those challenges with wisdom, strength, and peace. Grace doesn't remove every storm, but it gives you the power to stand firm when the winds are howling. Grace doesn't prevent every heartbreak, but it provides healing for every wound. You see, we live in a fallen world where pain and struggle are inevitable. But grace is God's way of ensuring that you're never alone in those struggles. Grace is the assurance that no matter what you face, you have divine resources available to you. Grace is the promise that every trial can become a testimony, every test can become a triumph. When you understand grace from this perspective, everything changes. You stop trying to fight your battles in your own strength. You stop carrying burdens that were never meant for your shoulders. You stop striving and start trusting. You stop performing and start receiving. Let me paint you a picture of what your life could look like when you're truly covered by God's grace. Imagine waking up each morning not with dread about the day ahead, but with anticipation. Imagine facing your biggest challenges not with fear, but with confidence, knowing that the same God who parted the Red Sea is working on your behalf. Imagine going to sleep each night, not tormented by regret or worry, but wrapped in the peace that comes from knowing you're completely loved and thoroughly protected. This isn't wishful thinking. This isn't some fantasy that only exists in storybooks. This is the reality that becomes available to you when you position yourself under the covering of God's grace. But here's what I've discovered in my own journey and in walking alongside countless others who have experienced this transformation. There's a difference between knowing about grace intellectually and experiencing grace personally. There's a difference between believing in grace as a concept and allowing grace to radically reshape your daily existence. The difference lies in how you approach this prayer. Most people pray at once and expect everything to change overnight. But the people who experience the most profound transformation are those who make this prayer a daily practice, a morning ritual, a consistent positioning of their heart before God. Let me tell you about Sarah, a single mother of two who was working 3 jobs just to make ends meet. Every morning felt like an uphill battle. Bills were piling up, her children needed things she couldn't afford, and she was exhausted beyond measure. She felt like she was failing at everything that mattered most to her. Then she started praying this prayer every single morning. Cover me with your grace, Lord. At first, nothing seemed to change. The bills were still there. The exhaustion was still real. The challenges hadn't disappeared. But Sarah kept praying it anyway, not because she felt like it was working, but because something deep inside her knew she needed to keep asking. After about a month of consistent prayer, something remarkable happened. Sarah received a phone call from a company she had applied to work for months earlier. They offered her a position that would pay more than all 3 of her current jobs combined, with benefits and flexible hours that would allow her to actually be present for her children. Coincidence? I don't think so. But here's the beautiful part of Sarah's story. The job wasn't even the biggest blessing. The biggest blessing was the transformation that happened in her heart during that month of consistent prayer. She learned to trust God in a way she never had before. She developed a peace that sustained her through uncertainty. She discovered a strength she didn't know she possessed. The external circumstances changed, yes, but the internal transformation was what made all the difference. Because now, no matter what challenges Sarah faces, she knows she's covered. She knows she's not fighting alone. She knows that grace is not just a theological concept, but a living reality that actively works in her life. This is what happens when you stop treating prayer like a last resort and start treating it like your first response. This is what happens when you stop seeing grace as something you occasionally need and start seeing it as something you constantly live under. Now I want to address something that might be stirring in your heart right now. Maybe you're thinking, this sounds wonderful, but I've messed up too many times. I've made too many mistakes. I've disappointed God too often. Surely His grace doesn't extend to someone like me. Friend, if that's what you're thinking, then you need to hear this more than anyone else in this room. Grace isn't diminished by your mistakes. Grace isn't reduced by your failures. Grace isn't conditional on your performance. Grace is God's response to your humanity, not your perfection. The Apostle Paul, who wrote extensively about grace, called himself the chief of sinners. This was a man who had persecuted Christians, who had made devastating mistakes, who carried regret and shame from his past. Yet he became one of the most powerful advocates for grace the world has ever known. Why? Because he understood that grace isn't about what you've done wrong. Grace is about what God does right. David, a man after God's own heart, committed adultery and murder. Yet he wrote some of the most beautiful psalms about God's unfailing love and mercy. Moses, the great deliverer, was a murderer who fled into the wilderness, yet God chose him to lead his people out of bondage. Peter, the rock upon which Jesus built his church, denied knowing Jesus 3 times, yet Jesus restored him and gave him the keys to the kingdom. Do you see the pattern here? God's grace isn't reserved for the perfect. It's lavished upon the broken, the flawed, the struggling, the human. Your past doesn't disqualify you from God's grace. If anything, it qualifies you for it, because grace is specifically designed for people who need it. When you pray, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," you're not asking God to overlook your flaws. You're asking Him to transform them. You're not asking Him to pretend your mistakes don't exist. You're asking Him to use them as stepping stones to something beautiful. Grace has this incredible ability to take what the enemy meant for evil and turn it into good. Grace can take your biggest failure and make it your greatest testimony. Grace can take your deepest wound and turn it into your most effective ministry. Grace can take your darkest valley and make it the very place where others find hope. But here's something crucial you need to understand about receiving God's grace. It requires a posture of humility. Pride says, "I can handle this myself." Grace says, "I need help." Pride says, "I'll figure it out." Grace says, "I surrender control." Pride says, "I have to earn this." Grace says, "I receive this as a gift." This is why Jesus said that unless you become like little children, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven. Children don't try to earn their parents' love. They don't perform to deserve care and provision. They simply receive it because they understand their need and trust in their parents' goodness. That's the heart posture that opens the door to experiencing God's grace in all its fullness. It's the recognition that you are completely dependent on Him, not just for salvation, but for every breath you take, every step you make, every challenge you face. When you wake up tomorrow morning and whisper, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," you're essentially saying, "God, I'm positioning myself as your child. I'm acknowledging that I need you. I'm trusting in your goodness. I'm opening my heart to receive everything you want to give me." And here's what God hears when you pray that prayer. He hears a heart that's ready to be loved. He hears a soul that's ready to be healed. He hears a life that's ready to be transformed. And His response is always the same. He opens the floodgates of heaven and pours out blessing upon blessing, not because you deserve it, but because that's who He is. This is the God who gives good gifts to His children. This is the Father who knows exactly what you need before you even ask. This is the Savior who has already made provision for every challenge you will ever face. This is the Holy Spirit who is ready to guide, comfort, strengthen, and empower you for whatever lies ahead. So when you understand this divine covering from heaven's perspective, something beautiful begins to unfold in your everyday life. You start to notice that the same situations that used to send you into panic now feel manageable. The same people who used to drain your energy somehow seem less threatening. The same circumstances that used to steal your joy somehow lose their power over your emotions. Why? Because you're operating from a different place now. You're not living from your own limited resources anymore. You're drawing from an unlimited supply of divine grace that never runs dry, never diminishes, and never fails to meet you exactly where you are. But let me share something with you that most people don't understand about this prayer. When you ask God to cover you with His grace, you're not just asking for a one-time blessing. You're entering into a covenant relationship where God becomes personally invested in your success, your healing, your breakthrough, your victory. Think about what happens when someone covers you physically. If you're cold and someone covers you with a warm blanket, they don't just throw it at you from across the room, they come close. They wrap it around you carefully. They make sure every part of you is protected from the cold. They stay near to ensure the covering remains in place. This is exactly what God does when His grace covers you. He doesn't send blessings from a distance. He draws near. He wraps His love around every broken place in your heart. He ensures that every area of your life that needs healing receives His personal attention. He stays close to make sure His covering never slips away. I want you to imagine what this looks like practically in your daily life. Picture yourself walking into that difficult conversation you've been dreading, but instead of anxiety consuming you, there's a supernatural calm that settles over your spirit. Picture yourself facing that financial crisis that's been keeping you awake at night, but instead of panic, there's an unexplainable confidence that God will make a way where there seems to be no way. Picture yourself dealing with that health challenge that's been weighing heavy on your mind, but instead of fear about the future, there's a deep knowing that whether God heals you or carries you through, His grace is sufficient for whatever comes. Picture yourself navigating that broken relationship that's been causing you heartache, but instead of bitterness taking root, there's a supernatural ability to forgive, to love, to hope again. This isn't positive thinking. This isn't mind over matter. This is grace actively working in your life, transforming not just your circumstances, but your capacity to handle whatever life throws your way. Let me tell you about Marcus, a businessman who was on the verge of losing everything. His company was failing, his marriage was falling apart, and he was struggling with depression so severe that some days he couldn't even get out of bed. He felt like he had let everyone down, like he was a complete failure as a husband, as a father, as a provider. One morning, at his absolute lowest point, Marcus fell to his knees in his empty office and cried out, "Cover me with your grace, Lord. I can't do this anymore. I don't have anything left." He wasn't even sure he believed God was listening, but desperation had brought him to a place where he was willing to try anything. What happened next wasn't a miraculous overnight turnaround. The problems didn't disappear immediately, but something shifted inside Marcus that day. Where there had been overwhelming despair, a small seed of hope began to grow. Where there had been paralyzing fear about the future, a quiet confidence started to emerge. Day by day, as Marcus continued to pray this prayer, he began to make decisions from a different place. Instead of operating from fear and desperation, he started operating from faith and wisdom. Instead of trying to control every outcome, he learned to trust the process. Instead of carrying the weight of everyone's expectations, he learned to rest in God's acceptance. And slowly, incredibly, things began to turn around. Not because Marcus suddenly became perfect, or because all his problems magically disappeared, but because grace was teaching him how to navigate his challenges with supernatural wisdom and strength. His business didn't just survive, it thrived in ways he never imagined possible. His marriage didn't just get back on track, it became stronger and more intimate than it had ever been. His depression didn't just lift, it was replaced by a joy and purpose he had never experienced before. But here's what Marcus will tell you is the most important part of his story. The external changes were wonderful, but the internal transformation was life-changing. He learned what it means to live under the covering of God's grace, and now nothing can shake his confidence in God's goodness. This is what's available to you right now, today. Not because you're special, but because God is faithful. Not because you deserve it, but because grace is God's nature. Not because you've earned it, but because love gives freely. Now, I want to address something that might be stirring in your spirit. Maybe you're thinking, I've tried praying before. I've asked God for help before. Nothing seemed to change. Why would this be any different? I understand that, do? Maybe you've hesitation. I've really been disappointed by unanswered prayers. Maybe you felt like God was silent when you needed him most. Maybe you've wondered if he really cares about the details of your daily struggles. But here's what I want you to understand about this particular prayer. When you ask God to cover you with his grace, you're not asking him to change your circumstances according to your timeline or your preferences. You're asking him to cover you with everything you need to thrive in whatever circumstances you face. Sometimes that means God changes your situation. Sometimes it means God changes you within your situation. Sometimes it means God gives you the strength to endure while he works behind the scenes to prepare something better. But always, it means you're not alone in whatever you're facing. The difference between this prayer and other prayers you might have prayed is that this prayer aligns your heart with God's heart. Instead of demanding specific outcomes, you're surrendering to his perfect will. Instead of trying to convince God to bless your plans, you're asking him to cover you with his plans. Instead of fighting for your way, you're trusting his way. And here's what's beautiful about that surrender. When you stop fighting God and start flowing with him, you discover that his plans for your life are so much better than anything you could have imagined for yourself. You discover that his timing, though different from yours, is always perfect. You discover that his ways, though sometimes mysterious, always lead to blessing. I think about the woman at the well that Jesus encountered in the 4th chapter of John's Gospel. She came to draw water in the heat of the day, at a time when she knew she wouldn't encounter other women from the town. Why? Because she was ashamed, broken, living with the consequences of choices that had left her isolated and hurting. But when Jesus met her there, he didn't lecture her about her past. He didn't condemn her for her mistakes. He didn't require her to clean up her life before he would talk to her. Instead, he offered her living water. He offered her grace. He offered her a covering that would transform not just her circumstances, but her very identity. And what happened? She went from being a woman who hid in shame to being a woman who ran through the town proclaiming the good news of what God had done in her life. She went from being isolated and rejected to being an evangelist who brought an entire city to encounter Jesus. She went from being defined by her past to being empowered by her future. That's the power of grace. That's what happens when God covers you with his unmerited favor. You don't just get a better life, you get a completely new identity. You don't just receive blessings, you become a blessing to others. You don't just experience transformation, you become a catalyst for transformation in other people's lives. This is why starting your day with this prayer is so crucial. When you position yourself under God's covering, first thing in the morning, you set the spiritual atmosphere for your entire day. You invite heaven to invade every appointment, every conversation, every decision, every challenge you'll face. You begin to move through your day not as someone who's hoping for the best, but as someone who knows they're covered by the best. You approach your responsibilities not as overwhelming burdens, but as opportunities for God's grace to be displayed through your life. You face your relationships not wondering if you'll have the wisdom and patience you need, but knowing that grace will provide exactly what's required for each interaction. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like practically. When your alarm goes off tomorrow morning, instead of immediately reaching for your phone to check messages or social media, What if you took just 2 minutes to whisper this prayer? Cover me with your grace, Lord. As you're getting ready for your day, what if you continued that conversation with God? Lord, I don't know what this day holds, but I know you hold this day. Cover my thoughts with your wisdom. Cover my words with your love. Cover my actions with your purpose. Cover my relationships with your peace. As you're driving to work or starting your daily responsibilities, what if you maintained that awareness of God's covering? Instead of letting anxiety about your to-do list consume your thoughts, what if you rested in the knowledge that grace is going before you, preparing the way, opening doors, orchestrating divine connections? When you encounter that difficult person, who usually triggers frustration in you, what if you remembered that you're covered by grace and therefore have access to supernatural patience and love? When you face that challenging situation that normally would overwhelm you, what if you drew from the strength that comes from being covered by God's unlimited resources? This isn't about perfection. You're still going to have moments where you forget, where you react from your flesh instead of from faith, where you slip back into old patterns of worry or fear. But grace covers those moments too. Grace gives you the ability to recognize when you've gotten off track and quickly return to the place of surrender and trust. And here's something beautiful that happens when you live under the covering of God's grace consistently. Other people start to notice something different about you. They can't quite put their finger on what it is, but there's a peace about you that doesn't make sense given your circumstances. There's a joy in you that isn't dependent on everything going your way. There's a strength in you that seems to come from somewhere beyond yourself. That's grace being displayed through your life. That's the covering of God becoming visible to others through your transformed perspective, your supernatural responses, your unexplainable peace in the midst of storms. And when people ask you what's different, when they want to know how you stay so calm under pressure, how you maintain hope when things look hopeless, how you find strength when everything seems overwhelming, you get to tell them about the grace that covers you. You get to share the prayer that changed everything. You get to be a living testimony of what God can do in a life that's surrendered to His covering. This is how the kingdom of God advances, not through perfect people doing extraordinary things, but through ordinary people allowing God's extraordinary grace to work through their surrendered lives. This is how revival begins, not in massive crusades or elaborate productions, but in individual hearts that cry out, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," and then live in the reality of that covering. So as we continue to explore what it means to live under God's grace, I want you to understand that you're not just learning about a nice spiritual concept. You're discovering a way of life that has the power to transform everything about your existence. You're tapping into a resource that never runs dry, never disappoints, and never fails to meet you exactly where you are, with exactly what you need. The woman I told you about earlier, the one who whispered that prayer in desperation, she later told me something that completely changed how I understood this covering of grace. She said, "I thought grace was just about God not being mad at me anymore. I had no idea it was about Him actively working on my behalf every single day." And that's exactly the revelation I want you to have right now. Grace isn't passive. Grace isn't God simply choosing not to punish you for your mistakes. Grace is the dynamic, active, present tense power of God working in your life right now at this very moment, orchestrating circumstances you can't see, opening doors you don't even know exist, and preparing blessings you haven't even thought to ask for. When you pray, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," you're activating something in the spiritual realm that begins to shift things in the natural realm. You're giving God permission to intervene in ways that might surprise you, challenge you, stretch you, but ultimately transform you into the person He's always known you could become. Let me tell you about Jennifer, a teacher who had been struggling in her classroom for years. Every day felt like a battle. The kids were disrespectful, the administration was unsupportive, and she was going home exhausted and defeated every single afternoon. She loved teaching, but she was beginning to think she wasn't cut out for it anymore. One morning, feeling particularly overwhelmed about facing another difficult day, Jennifer decided to try something "Cover me with your grace, Lord," different. Before she even got out of bed, she purred, "I can't handle these kids on my own. I need your wisdom, your patience, your love to flow through me today." Now, the kids didn't suddenly become angels. The administration didn't immediately change their policies, but something shifted in Jennifer that day. She found herself responding to disruptions with a calmness she didn't recognize. When a student was acting out, instead of feeling frustrated, She felt compassion and somehow knew exactly what to say to reach that child's heart. By the end of the week, other teachers were asking Jennifer what had changed. Students who had been her biggest challenges were starting to participate positively in class. Parents were sending notes thanking her for the difference she was making in their children's lives. What happened? Grace happened. Not grace as a theological concept, but grace as a living reality that transformed how Jennifer showed up in her classroom every single day. But here's what I want you to understand about Jennifer's story. The transformation didn't happen because she prayed once and everything magically became easy. The transformation happened because she chose to position herself under God's covering every single morning, and grace began to work through her in ways she never imagined possible. This is the key that most people miss. They think grace is something you receive once and then you're set for life. But grace is actually something you live under daily, something you draw from constantly, something you remain conscious of throughout every moment of your day. Think about it like this. If you have a beautiful umbrella at home in your closet, it's not going to keep you dry if it's raining and you're walking down the street. The umbrella only protects you if you take it with you and hold it over your head. Grace works the same way. It's not enough to know that God's grace exists. You have to consciously position yourself under it and stay aware of its covering throughout your day. This is why the most transformed people I know are those who have made this prayer a non-negotiable part of their morning routine. Not because they're more spiritual than everyone else, but because they've learned to tap into a resource that changes everything about how they navigate life. Let me share with you what happened to Robert, a man who came to me completely broken after his business partnership fell apart in the most devastating way possible. His best friend and business partner had been embezzling money for years, and when it all came to light, Robert lost everything. His life savings, his reputation, his ability to trust anyone ever again. Robert was angry, bitter, and consumed with thoughts of revenge. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't function. He felt like his entire world had collapsed, and honestly, he wasn't sure he wanted to keep living. When someone suggested he try praying for God's grace to cover him, Robert almost laughed. He said, "Grace? Where was God's grace when my life was being destroyed? Where was God's grace when I was being lied to and stolen from every single day for 3 years?" But desperation has a way of making us open to things we might normally reject. So Robert, with nothing left to lose, started praying this prayer every morning. Not because he felt like it would work, not because he had great faith, but because he literally had nowhere else to turn. For the first few weeks, nothing seemed to change. The anger was still there. The bitterness was still consuming him. The financial devastation was still real. But Robert kept praying anyway, mostly because he didn't know what else to do. Then something interesting began to happen. Robert started having different thoughts about his former partner. Instead of only thinking about revenge, he began to feel sorry for him. Instead of being consumed with hatred, he started to feel compassion for someone who was so broken inside that he would destroy a friendship for money. This wasn't Robert trying to be spiritual or trying to force forgiveness. This was grace working in his heart, softening what had become hard, healing what had been wounded, transforming what had been poisoned by bitterness. Within 6 months, Robert had not only forgiven his former partner, but he had started a new business that became more successful than his previous one had ever been. More importantly, he had developed a relationship with God that sustained him through every challenge that followed. But here's what Robert will tell you is the most amazing part of his story. The greatest blessing wasn't getting his money back or starting a successful new business. The greatest blessing was discovering that God's grace could reach into the darkest, most bitter places of his heart and bring healing he never thought was possible. That's what grace does. It doesn't just change your circumstances, though it often does that too. Grace changes you from the inside out, transforming your capacity to handle whatever life brings your way. Now, I know some of you are sitting there thinking, but my situation is different. My pain is deeper. My circumstances are more complicated. This might work for other people, but you don't understand what I'm dealing with. And you're right, I don't know the specific details of your struggle. I don't know the depth of your pain or the complexity of your circumstances. But here's what I do know. Grace is bigger than your biggest problem. Grace is stronger than your strongest addiction. Grace is deeper than your deepest wound. Grace is more powerful than your most overwhelming circumstance. This isn't wishful thinking or spiritual platitudes. This is the testimony of countless people who have discovered that when you position yourself under God's covering, He meets you exactly where you are and gives you exactly what you need to not just survive, but to thrive. I think about Maria, a single mother who was working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over her children's heads. Every month was a struggle to pay rent, buy groceries, and cover basic necessities. She felt like she was failing her kids because she couldn't give them the things other children had. The stress was overwhelming, and she was beginning to feel hopeless about their future. Then Maria started praying this prayer every morning. Cover me with your grace, Lord. Cover my children with your grace. Provide what we need and help me trust you with what we don't have. The bills didn't disappear overnight. Her financial situation didn't magically transform, but something shifted in Maria's perspective. Instead of seeing lack everywhere she looked, she began to notice provision. Instead of focusing on what she couldn't give her children, she started celebrating what she could give them. Her children began to sense the difference in their mother. Where there had been stress and anxiety, there was now peace and gratitude. Where there had been worry about the future, there was now trust in God's faithfulness. And in that atmosphere of grace, those children began to thrive in ways that had nothing to do with material possessions. But grace wasn't finished with Maria's story. Within a year of consistently praying this prayer, she received a promotion at one of her jobs that doubled her income. She was able to move her family into a better neighborhood and provide opportunities for her children she had only dreamed of before. The transformation in Maria's circumstances was wonderful, but the transformation in Maria's heart was even more beautiful. She learned that grace doesn't just meet your needs, it transforms your ability to trust God with your needs. This is what happens when you stop trying to figure everything out on your own and start resting in the knowledge that you're covered by someone who sees the bigger picture, who knows the end from the beginning, who is working all things together for your good. But let me address something that might be stirring in your heart. Maybe you're thinking, I've made too many bad decisions. I've wasted too many opportunities. I've hurt too many people. Surely I've disqualified myself from this kind of blessing. Friend, that thinking is exactly what keeps people trapped in cycles of defeat and shame. That's the voice of condemnation, not the voice of grace. Grace doesn't ask you to be perfect before you can receive it. Grace is what makes it possible for imperfect people to experience God's perfect love. The Apostle Paul understood this better than anyone. He wrote more about grace than any other author in the New Testament, and he did it as someone who had a past filled with regret. Before he became Paul the Apostle, he was Saul the persecutor, someone who actively worked against everything God was doing in the earth. Yet when grace encountered him on the road to Damascus, it didn't require him to spend years making up for his past mistakes. Grace immediately transformed his identity, his purpose, and his destiny. Grace took his greatest shame and turned it into his most powerful testimony. That's what grace wants to do in your life too. It wants to take the very things you're most ashamed of and transform them into sources of strength, wisdom, and compassion that will enable you to help others who are struggling with similar challenges. When you pray, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," you're not asking God to overlook your past. You're asking Him to redeem it, to use it, to transform it into something beautiful. You're positioning yourself to receive not just forgiveness, but complete restoration. I remember talking to a man named David who had struggled with addiction for over 20 years. He had lost jobs, damaged relationships, disappointed his family, and destroyed his own self-worth in the process. He had tried rehab multiple times, had made countless promises to change, but nothing seemed to stick. When David first heard about this prayer, he was skeptical. He said, "I've tried praying before, I've made deals with God before, I've begged and pleaded and promised to change. Why would this be any different?" But something deep inside him knew he was at the end of himself, and he was willing to try anything. So David started praying this prayer every morning, not because he had great faith, but because he had great desperation. "Cover me with your grace, Lord. I can't beat this addiction on my own. I need your strength, your power, your healing to flow through my life today." The cravings didn't disappear immediately. The temptations didn't suddenly become easy to resist, but David began to notice that he had access to strength he didn't recognize. When he would normally give in to temptation, he found himself making different choices. When he would typically isolate himself in shame, he found himself reaching out for help instead. Day by day, week by week, month by month, grace was doing in David's life what willpower and determination had never been able to accomplish. It wasn't that David became perfect or that he never faced challenges. It was that grace was giving him supernatural ability to overcome challenges that had previously defeated him. Today, David has been clean for over 5 years. But more importantly, he has become someone who helps other people find freedom from the addictions that have held them captive. His greatest weakness became his greatest ministry, all because grace covered him and transformed what seemed irredeemable into something incredibly beautiful. This is the power of positioning yourself under God's covering every single day. You're not just asking for help with today's challenges. You're positioning yourself for the complete transformation of your story. But here's something crucial I want you to understand about this covering of grace. It's not just about receiving blessings for yourself. When you're truly covered by God's grace, it begins to overflow into the lives of everyone around you. You become a conduit of grace to others who desperately need what you've received. Think about it this way. When you're standing under an umbrella during a rainstorm, you stay dry. But if someone else steps close to you under that same umbrella, they benefit from the covering too. Grace works the same way. When you position yourself under God's covering, you create space for others to experience that same protection and blessing. This is why your family members start to notice a difference when you begin living under the covering of grace. Your patience with them increases. Your ability to love them unconditionally grows. Your capacity to forgive quickly and completely expands. They may not understand what's happening, but they benefit from the overflow of grace in your life. Your co-workers begin to experience this too. Instead of adding to the stress and negativity in your workplace, you become a source of peace and encouragement. Instead of participating in gossip and complaining, you become someone who speaks life and hope. Instead of being part of the problem, you become part of the solution. Your community begins to feel the impact as well. You become the neighbor who checks on others during difficult times. You become the person who volunteers to help when there's a need. You become someone who brings light into dark situations instead of adding to the darkness. This isn't about becoming perfect or pretending you don't have struggles. This is about allowing God's grace to work through your humanity in ways that bless others and bring glory to His name. Let me tell you about Linda, a woman who started praying this prayer during one of the most difficult seasons of her life. Her teenage daughter was rebelling, her marriage was struggling, and she was dealing with her own health issues. Every day felt like a battle on multiple fronts, but as Linda positioned herself under God's covering each morning, something began to shift in her family's atmosphere. Instead of reacting to her daughter's rebellion with anger and control, Linda found herself responding with love and wisdom. Instead of adding to the tension in her marriage with criticism and demands, she began to offer grace and understanding. Her daughter began to notice the change first. Where her mother had previously met her rebellion with lectures and punishment, she was now meeting it with patience and unconditional love. Slowly, the walls between them began to come down, and real communication became possible again. Her husband noticed it too. The woman he married was returning, but she was somehow even better than before. More patient, more understanding, more at peace with herself and with life. Their relationship began to heal in ways neither of them had dared to hope for. But the most beautiful part of Linda's story is what happened with her health. As the stress decreased and peace increased in her life, her physical symptoms began to improve. Her doctor was amazed at the changes in her test results and asked what she had been doing differently. Linda's response was simple. I stopped trying to control everything and started trusting God to cover me with His grace. Her doctor didn't fully understand what that meant, but he couldn't argue with the results he was seeing in her health and wellness. This is what happens when grace covers every area of your life. Physical health improves because stress decreases. Relationships heal because love increases. Circumstances change because you're operating from a different spiritual position. You see, when you position yourself under God's covering, you're not just changing your prayer life, you're changing your entire approach to life. Instead of trying to manage everything in your own strength, you're learning to partner with someone who has unlimited resources and perfect wisdom. Instead of carrying the weight of everyone's expectations and your own perfectionism, you're learning to rest in the knowledge that you're completely accepted and thoroughly loved exactly as you are. Instead of striving to earn approval and blessing, you're learning to receive them as gifts from a generous Father who delights in giving good things to His children. This shift in perspective changes everything about how you show up in the world. You become more authentic because you're not trying to hide your flaws. You become more confident because your identity is secure in God's love. You become more generous because you're operating from abundance rather than scarcity. People are drawn to this kind of authenticity. They can sense that you have something they need, even if they can't articulate what it is. And when they ask you about the peace they see in your life, the joy that doesn't depend on circumstances, the strength that seems to come from somewhere beyond yourself, you get to tell them about the grace that covers you. You get to share the prayer that changed everything. You get to invite them into the same relationship with God that has transformed your life. You get to be part of their story of redemption and restoration. This is how revival spreads, not through elaborate programs or perfect presentations, but through ordinary people living extraordinary lives under the covering of God's grace. This is how the kingdom of God advances, one transformed heart at a time, one surrendered life at a time, one morning prayer at a time. So as you begin to understand the depth and breadth of what it means to be covered by God's grace, I want you to realize that you're not just discovering a new way to pray, you're discovering a new way to live, a way that's marked by peace instead of anxiety, by hope instead of despair, by love instead of fear. You're discovering what it means to live from rest instead of striving, from abundance instead of scarcity, from security instead of insecurity. You're learning to draw from resources that never run dry, and to operate from a position of strength that doesn't depend on your circumstances. And the beautiful thing is, this is just the beginning. Every day that you position yourself under God's covering, you'll discover new dimensions of His grace working in your life. Every morning that you pray this prayer with sincerity and faith, you'll experience fresh mercies and new reasons to praise Him for His goodness. The journey of living under grace is not a destination you arrive at. It's a daily walk you embark upon. It's not a one-time decision you make. It's a moment-by-moment choice to trust, to surrender, to receive, to rest in the knowledge that you are completely covered by the one who loves you most. Tomorrow morning, when that alarm goes off and your feet hit the floor, I want you to remember something profound that most people never realize. The moment you whisper those words, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," you're not just starting another day. You're activating a spiritual reality that's been waiting for your invitation to transform everything about your existence. But here's what I've discovered in walking alongside thousands of people who have made this prayer their daily foundation. There are layers to this covering that most believers never experience because they stop at the surface level. They pray the words once or twice, maybe see some small changes, and think they've tapped into everything grace has to offer. But grace is like an ocean, not a puddle. You can wade in the shallow waters and get your feet wet, or you can dive deep into the depths where the real transformation happens. The people who experience the most radical life changes are those who learn to swim in the deep waters of God's grace, who understand that this covering operates on multiple levels simultaneously. Let me explain what I mean by sharing the story of Rebecca, a nurse who worked the night shift at a busy hospital. For 15 years, she had been pouring herself out for others, caring for patients, comforting families, making life and death decisions in the middle of the night. But somewhere along the way, she had lost herself in the process. Rebecca came home every morning emotionally drained, spiritually empty, and physically exhausted. She loved her calling, but she felt like she was slowly dying inside. The constant exposure to pain, suffering, and loss had created a hardness in her heart that she didn't recognize. She was becoming cynical, bitter, and disconnected from the compassion that had originally drawn her to nursing. When Rebecca first started praying this prayer, she was hoping for physical strength to get through her shifts without collapsing. And yes, that's exactly what she received. But grace had so much more in store for her than just physical endurance. Within weeks of consistently asking God to cover her with His grace, Rebecca began to notice something remarkable happening during her shifts. Instead of seeing her patients as burdens or problems to solve, she started seeing them as people created in God's image, each one deserving of love and dignity. Instead of going through the motions of care, she found herself genuinely connecting with each person she served, but the transformation went even deeper than that. Rebecca discovered that when she positioned herself under God's covering before each shift, she had access to supernatural discernment. She would sense things about her patients that weren't in their charts. She would know when someone needed extra comfort, when a family member needed encouragement, when a situation required immediate attention. Her colleagues began to notice that Rebecca had developed an almost uncanny ability to be exactly where she was needed most at exactly the right time. Families started requesting her specifically because they could sense something different about the care she provided. Other nurses began asking her what had changed, how she managed to maintain such compassion and energy in such a demanding environment. Rebecca's response was always the same. I stopped trying to be the source of healing and started allowing myself to be a conduit for the ultimate healer. This is what happens when you understand that God's grace doesn't just cover your personal needs and struggles. It covers your calling, your purpose, your ability to impact others in ways you never imagined possible. When you pray, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," you're not just asking for protection from life's storms. You're asking to be positioned as an instrument of heaven's intervention in earth's circumstances. You're volunteering to be used as a vessel through which God's love, wisdom, power, and presence can flow into situations that desperately need divine touch. Think about Moses when he asked God to show him his glory. God responded by placing Moses in the cleft of a rock and covering him with his hand as his glory passed by. Moses wasn't just protected from being consumed by God's holiness. He was positioned to receive a revelation of God's character that would sustain him through every challenge he would face as a leader. That's exactly what happens when you consistently position yourself under the covering of God's grace. You're not just receiving protection and blessing, you're receiving revelation about who God is and who you are in Him. You're developing spiritual sensitivity that enables you to recognize His voice, discern His will, and participate in His purposes. But here's where many people get stuck. They experience some level of blessing and transformation, and they think that's all there is. They don't realize that grace has dimensions they haven't even begun to explore. They settle for the shallow end, when God is inviting them into the deep waters where miracles are normal and impossibilities become possibilities. Let me tell you about Thomas, a construction worker who was facing the loss of his family farm. His father had passed away unexpectedly, leaving behind massive debts that Thomas couldn't possibly pay. The farm had been in his family for 4 generations, and the thought of losing it was devastating, not just financially, but emotionally and spiritually. Thomas started praying this prayer out of desperation, not really expecting much to change. The debts were still there, the bank was still demanding payment, and there seemed to be no way out of the situation. But as Thomas continued to position himself under God's covering each morning, something unexpected began to happen. He started receiving ideas about how to increase the farm's productivity using methods he had never considered before. He began to see opportunities for additional income streams that had been right in front of him all along. More importantly, Thomas found himself making connections with people who had resources and expertise he needed. A banker who was known for being tough and unforgiving suddenly became interested in working out a payment plan. A neighboring farmer offered to lease some unused land at a price that made all the difference. An agricultural consultant volunteered his services without charge because he believed in what Thomas was trying to accomplish. Within 18 months, not only had Thomas saved the family farm, but it had become more profitable than it had ever been in its history. What seemed like the end of everything became the beginning of something greater than anyone had imagined. But Thomas will tell you that the most valuable thing he gained wasn't financial stability or even keeping the farm. The most valuable thing was learning that when you position yourself under God's covering, you gain access to His infinite creativity and resources. You discover that the same God who created everything from nothing can create solutions where no solutions exist. This is what I mean when I say there are layers to grace that most people never experience. Surface-level grace gives you comfort and peace. Deeper grace gives you supernatural ability and divine connections. But the deepest level of grace gives you access to the creative power of God Himself, the ability to participate in bringing heaven's realities into earth's circumstances. When you understand this, your morning prayer becomes something entirely different. Instead of just asking God to help you get through another day, you're positioning yourself to be part of His kingdom, advancing on earth. Instead of just seeking personal blessing, you're volunteering to be used as an agent of transformation in other people's lives. Consider what happened to Patricia, a high school counselor who was watching her students struggle with issues that seemed beyond anything she had been trained to handle. Depression, anxiety, family dysfunction, addiction, violence, hopelessness. Every day she felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of pain and brokenness she was witnessing in these young lives. Traditional counseling methods were helping some students, but Patricia knew that what these young people really needed went far deeper than anything she could provide through conventional means. They needed hope, purpose, identity, and unconditional love. They needed to know that their lives had value and meaning beyond their current circumstances. When Patricia began praying this prayer each morning before work, she wasn't just asking for wisdom to help her students. She was asking God to cover her office, her conversations, her entire approach to counseling with His grace. She was inviting heaven to invade the atmosphere of her workplace and transform it into a place of healing and restoration. The changes were subtle at first. Students who had been resistant to counseling suddenly became more open to conversation. Young people who had been caught in destructive patterns began making different choices. Parents who had been at their wits' end started finding new ways to connect with their children. But then something extraordinary began to happen. Students started coming to Patricia's office not because they were in trouble, but because they could sense that something different happened when they were in her presence. They couldn't articulate what it was, but they knew they felt better, more hopeful, more at peace when they talked with her. Word spread throughout the school that Mrs. Patricia's office was a place where real help was available. Teachers began referring students not just for academic issues, but for any kind of struggle they were facing. The principal noticed that disciplinary problems decreased significantly among students who had spent time in Patricia's office. What was happening? Grace was creating an atmosphere of healing and transformation that went far beyond what any counseling technique could accomplish. Patricia had become a conduit for God's love and healing power to flow into the lives of broken young people. But here's the most beautiful part of Patricia's story. She began to see these students not just as cases to solve or problems to fix, but as beloved children of God who were created for purpose and destined for greatness. That shift in perspective changed everything about how she interacted with them. Instead of focusing on their failures and mistakes, she began calling out their potential and their value. Instead of just addressing their symptoms, she began speaking to their identity and their future. Instead of just offering coping strategies, she began offering hope and vision for what their lives could become. The transformation in these students' lives was remarkable, but the transformation in Patricia's life was equally profound. She discovered that when you position yourself as a vessel for God's grace to flow through, you don't just help others. You experience the joy and fulfillment that comes from participating in God's redemptive work in the world. This is what happens when you move beyond just receiving grace for your own needs and begin to understand that you're called to be a distributor of grace to others who desperately need what you've received. Now let me address something that might be stirring in your heart right now. Maybe you're thinking, this sounds incredible, but I don't feel qualified to be used by God in such significant ways. I'm not a nurse or a teacher or a counselor. I don't have a platform or special training. How could God possibly use someone like me? Friend, that thinking reveals a fundamental misunderstanding about how grace operates. Grace doesn't require you to be qualified. Grace qualifies you. Grace doesn't demand that you have special training. Grace provides supernatural enabling. Grace doesn't need you to have a big platform. Grace can use your ordinary circumstances to create extraordinary impact. Think about the boy with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He wasn't qualified to feed 5,000 people. He didn't have special training in miracle multiplication. He didn't have a platform or influence. All he had was a willingness to give what little he had to Jesus, and grace took that small offering and used it to meet the needs of multitudes. The same thing can happen with your life when you position yourself under God's covering and make yourself available to be used for His purposes. Your workplace can become a place where heaven touches earth. Your neighborhood can become a place where hope is restored. Your family can become a place where healing and reconciliation flow. It's not about your ability or qualifications. It's about your availability and your willingness to be covered by grace, and then allow that grace to overflow into the lives of everyone around you. Let me tell you about Carlos, a mechanic who worked at a small auto repair shop in a rough neighborhood. Every day he dealt with customers who were frustrated, stressed, and often angry about their car troubles. Many of them were struggling financially and couldn't afford major repairs. The atmosphere in the shop was usually tense and negative. Carlos had been a believer for years, but he had never really thought about his job as a place where ministry could happen. He went to church on Sundays, but Monday through Friday was just about making a living and getting through each day. When Carlos began praying this prayer each morning, asking God to cover him with grace, something began to shift in how he approached his work. Instead of just seeing broken cars, he started seeing people who needed encouragement and hope. Instead of just focusing on making money, he began looking for ways to bless his customers. Carlos started doing small things that made a big difference. When he discovered that a single mother couldn't afford the full repair her car needed, he found a way to fix the most critical issue for the amount of money she had. When an elderly man was worried about being stranded with car trouble, Carlos gave him his personal phone number and told him to call if he needed help. Word began to spread in the neighborhood that there was a mechanic who actually cared about his customers, who was honest in his pricing, and who would go out of his way to help people in difficult situations. People started coming to Carlos not just for car repairs, but for advice, encouragement, and prayer. The transformation of that auto repair shop was remarkable. What had been a place of stress and conflict became a place where people experienced kindness, integrity, and genuine care. Other mechanics in the shop began to notice the difference and started asking Carlos what had changed in his approach. Carlos's answer was simple. I stopped just fixing cars and started serving people with the love of God. But here's what's most beautiful about Carlos's story. He discovered that when you allow grace to transform your ordinary work into ministry, your job becomes more than just a paycheck. It becomes a calling, a place where you get to participate in God's work of healing and restoration in people's lives. This is available to every single person who makes the decision to position themselves under God's covering and allow His grace to flow through their daily activities. Whether you're a store clerk, a teacher, a parent, a student, a retiree, or anything else, your life can become a conduit for heaven's intervention in earth's circumstances. The key is understanding that grace doesn't just change your circumstances. Grace changes your perspective on your circumstances. It changes how you see the people around you, how you approach your responsibilities, and how you respond to both challenges and opportunities. When you wake up tomorrow morning and pray, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," you're not just asking for a pleasant day. You're positioning yourself to be used as an instrument of God's love in a world that desperately needs to experience His goodness. But let me share something with you that will take your understanding of this covering to an even deeper level. When you consistently live under the covering of God's grace, you begin to develop what I call grace vision. You start to see situations, people, and circumstances the way God sees them. Instead of just seeing problems, you begin to see possibilities. Instead of just seeing obstacles, you begin to see opportunities. Instead of just seeing what is, you begin to see what could be if heaven were to intervene. This grace vision enables you to pray with greater authority and specificity. Instead of just praying general prayers for blessing, you begin to pray strategic prayers that align with what God is already wanting to do in specific situations. Let me illustrate this with the story of Janet, a woman who lived in an apartment complex where there was constant conflict between neighbors. Noise complaints, parking disputes, children getting into trouble, elderly residents feeling unsafe and isolated. The atmosphere was toxic, and people avoided each other as much as possible. Janet had been living there for 2 years, mostly keeping to herself and trying to stay out of the drama. But after she began positioning herself under God's covering each morning, something began to stir in her heart about the community where she lived. Instead of just praying for her own peace and safety, Janet began to pray for the entire apartment complex. She started asking God to cover the whole property with His grace, to bring healing to relationships, and to transform the atmosphere from conflict to community. But Grace Vision enabled Janet to see specific ways she could participate in the answer to her own prayers. She began to notice opportunities to show kindness that she had previously overlooked. She started bringing extra groceries to elderly neighbors who had difficulty getting to the store. She organized a community garden where residents could work together on something positive. Slowly but surely, the atmosphere in the apartment complex began to change. People who had been enemies started talking to each other. Children who had been getting into trouble found constructive activities to occupy their time. Elderly residents who had been isolated began to feel included and valued. What started as one woman positioning herself under God's covering became a transformation that affected an entire community. Janet became a catalyst for grace to invade a place that had been marked by division and create an environment of peace and mutual support. This is what happens when you understand that your personal covering of grace is designed to expand and encompass the spheres of influence where God has placed you. Your family, your workplace, your neighborhood, your community, all become candidates for transformation when you learn to see them through eyes of grace. But here's something even more profound that I want you to understand. When you live under the covering of God's grace consistently, you begin to partner with Him in ways that affect not just your immediate circumstances, but the broader spiritual climate of your region. You see, every person who positions themselves under God's covering becomes what Scripture calls a watchman on the wall. You become someone who stands in the gap for others, who intercedes for breakthrough in situations that seem hopeless, who believes for transformation in places where darkness has seemed to prevail. This is not about becoming some super spiritual person who's disconnected from real life. This is about becoming so connected to the heart of God that you begin to feel His burden for the people and places around you. You begin to understand that your personal covering of grace is actually part of a much larger network of believers who are positioned strategically throughout the earth to advance God's kingdom. When you pray, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," you're not just positioning yourself for personal blessing. You're joining a global community of believers who are partnering with heaven to bring transformation to earth. You're becoming part of God's strategy for healing nations, restoring communities, and demonstrating His love to a world that desperately needs to see His goodness in action. This understanding will revolutionize not just how you pray, but how you live. You'll begin to see your daily activities as opportunities to advance God's kingdom. You'll start recognizing divine appointments in what used to seem like random encounters. You'll develop sensitivity to the Holy Spirit's leading that enables you to be in the right place at the right time with exactly what someone needs. The woman I mentioned at the beginning of this message, the one who first whispered this prayer in desperation, she later told me something that completely changed how I understood the scope of what God wants to do through surrendered lives. She said, "I thought I was just asking for help to get through my own struggles. I had no idea God wanted to use me to help others get through theirs." That's the heart of what it means to be covered by grace. It's not just about receiving, it's about becoming a conduit through which others can receive. It's not just about being blessed, it's about becoming a blessing. It's not just about finding peace for yourself. It's about becoming an agent of peace in a chaotic world. As we continue to explore the depths of what this covering means, I want you to begin to see yourself not just as someone who needs grace, but as someone through whom grace flows. Not just as someone who receives God's love, but as someone who distributes God's love. Not just as someone who benefits from God's power, but as someone through whom God's power is demonstrated. This shift in perspective will transform everything about how you approach tomorrow morning. When you wake up and whisper those words, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," you'll understand that you're not just starting another day. You're stepping into another opportunity to partner with heaven in bringing transformation to earth. And as you begin to grasp this truth, something magnificent starts to unfold in your understanding. You realize that every challenge you've faced, every struggle that has brought you to your knees, every moment of weakness that has driven you to desperation, has actually been preparing you for this very revelation. God hasn't been absent during your difficulties. He's been positioning you to understand your desperate need for His covering, so that when you finally cry out for it, you'll receive it with the kind of gratitude and reverence it deserves. Think about what happens when someone who has never been truly thirsty is offered a glass of water. They might appreciate it. They might even say thank you, but they don't understand its life-giving value the same way someone does who has been wandering in the desert for days. The person who has experienced genuine thirst doesn't just drink the water. They treasure it means to be every drop because they know what without it. That's exactly what happens when you come to God from a place of genuine need and ask Him to cover you with His grace. You don't just receive it casually. You receive it with the deep appreciation of someone who understands that without it, you simply cannot make it through another day. Let me share with you the story of Michael, a firefighter who thought he had life figured out. He was strong, capable, trained to handle emergencies and save lives. For 15 years, he had been the one people called when they needed help, the one who ran into burning buildings while others ran out, the one who always seemed to have everything under control. But then came the night that changed everything. Michael was called to a house fire where a family was trapped on the second floor. He had performed similar rescues hundreds of times, but this time, something went wrong. The floor collapsed beneath him, and he found himself pinned under burning debris, unable to move, watching helplessly as the family he was trying to save perished in the flames above him. Michael survived physically, but emotionally and spiritually, something died in that fire. The man who had always been everyone else's strength suddenly couldn't find strength for himself. He developed PTSD, struggled with survivor's guilt, and began to question everything he had believed about God's protection and his own purpose. For months, Michael isolated himself from everyone. He couldn't work, couldn't sleep, couldn't even pray. He felt abandoned by God and convinced that his life no longer had any meaning or value. His wife didn't know how to help him. His children were afraid of the stranger their father had become. His colleagues at the fire department watched helplessly as one of their strongest members completely fell apart. Then one morning, at his absolute lowest point, Michael found himself on his knees in his garage, surrounded by all the firefighting equipment that used to represent his identity and his purpose. Through tears of desperation, he whispered words he had never thought he would need to say, "Cover me with your grace, Lord. I can't save anyone, including myself. I need you to do what I cannot do." Now I want you to understand something important about Michael's story. The transformation didn't happen overnight. His PTSD didn't disappear immediately. The memories of that terrible night didn't just fade away, but something fundamental shifted in Michael's heart that morning. For the first time since the accident, he wasn't trying to be strong enough to handle everything on his own. Day after day, Michael continued to position himself under God's covering, even when he didn't feel like it, even when it seemed like nothing was changing. "Cover me with your grace, Lord. Give me strength to face this day. Help me to find purpose again. Show me how to be a husband and father when I feel like I'm falling apart inside." Gradually, almost imperceptibly at first, grace began to do its healing work in Michael's broken places. He started to sleep for longer periods. He began to engage in conversations with his wife again. He found the courage to seek professional help for his trauma. Most importantly, he started to understand that his identity wasn't based on his ability to save everyone, but on God's ability to save him. Within a year, Michael was not only back at work, but he had become the person his fellow firefighters came to when they were struggling with their own trauma and stress. His experience of being broken and needing grace had given him a compassion and wisdom he never possessed when he thought he was invincible. But here's the most beautiful part of Michael's transformation. He realized that his greatest ministry wasn't in the burning buildings he entered, but in the broken lives he could now touch with the same grace that had covered him. His weakness had become his strength. His breakdown had become his breakthrough. His desperate need for grace had become his greatest qualification to help others who were desperately in need of the same covering. This is what I want you to understand about the seasons of difficulty you've walked through. God hasn't wasted a single tear you've cried, a single sleepless night you've endured, a single moment of desperation you've experienced. He's been preparing you to receive His grace with the kind of gratitude that transforms not just your circumstances, but your character. When you've tried to fix everything in your own strength and failed, you develop humility. When you've carried burdens that were too heavy for your shoulders, you develop dependence on God. When you've faced situations that were beyond your ability to control, you develop trust in His sovereignty. When you've experienced your own weakness, you develop appreciation for His strength. All of these qualities position you to receive grace in its fullness and then become a conduit through which others can experience the same transformation you've received. But let me tell you something that will completely revolutionize how you understand the covering of God's grace. Most people think of grace as God's response to their failure, His kindness when they mess up, His mercy when they fall short. And while that's certainly true, it's only a small fraction of what grace actually encompasses. Grace is also God's empowerment for success. Grace is His supernatural enabling for you to accomplish things you could never accomplish in your own strength. Grace is His divine favor opening doors that no human effort could open. Grace is His wisdom flowing through your mind to solve problems you don't have the knowledge to solve. Grace is His love flowing through your heart to reach people you don't have the capacity to reach. When you position yourself under God's covering and ask Him to cover you with His grace, you're not just asking for forgiveness and comfort. You're asking for supernatural empowerment to live a life that exceeds your natural limitations. You're positioning yourself to experience what the Apostle Paul called God's power working through you to accomplish infinitely more than you could ask or imagine. This understanding changes everything about how you approach your dreams, your goals, your calling, and your purpose. Instead of looking at what you want to accomplish and feeling overwhelmed by your limitations, you start looking at what God wants to accomplish through you and feeling excited about His unlimited resources. Consider the story of Rachel, a young woman who had always dreamed of starting a non-profit organization to help homeless families, but felt completely unqualified for such a massive undertaking. She had no business experience, no connections in the non-profit world, no significant financial resources, and no idea where to begin. For years, Rachel carried this dream in her heart, but never acted on it because the obstacles seemed insurmountable. Every time she thought about taking the first step, she became overwhelmed by all the things she didn't know how to do and all the resources she didn't have. Then Rachel discovered what it meant to position herself under the covering of God's grace each morning. Instead of focusing on her limitations, she began to focus on God's unlimited ability to work through surrendered lives. Instead of asking, "How can I possibly do this?" she started asking God, "How do you want to do this through me? Cover me with your grace, Lord. Give me your wisdom to know how to help these families. Provide the resources, the connections, the knowledge I need. Use my willingness to make a difference in lives that desperately need hope." Within 6 months of consistently praying this prayer, remarkable things began to happen. Rachel met a woman at a coffee shop who turned out to be a lawyer specializing in non-profit law, and she offered to help Rachel set up her organization for free. A conversation with a neighbor led to an introduction to a city council member who was looking for community partners to address homelessness. A social media post about her dream caught the attention of a local business owner who had been looking for a worthy cause to support financially. One connection led to another. One opportunity opened up the next. And within 2 years, Rachel's nonprofit was serving dozens of families and had become a model for other communities dealing with similar challenges. But here's what Rachel will tell you is the most amazing part of her story. The greatest blessing wasn't the success of her organization or even the families they were able to help, though both of those were incredible. The greatest blessing was discovering that when you position yourself under God's covering and make yourself available for His purposes, you get to participate in miracles that are far beyond anything you could accomplish on your own. Rachel learned that grace doesn't just forgive your inadequacies, it transforms them into qualifications. Grace doesn't just overlook your limitations, it transcends them. Grace doesn't just help you do better with what you have, it provides what you don't have, so you can accomplish what seems impossible. This is the level of grace that most believers never experience because they stop at asking for help with their problems instead of asking for empowerment to fulfill their purpose. They remain focused on what they need God to fix instead of discovering what God wants to build through their surrendered lives. Now I want you to imagine what your life could look like if you understood that the same grace that forgives your sins also empowers your dreams. The same grace that comforts you in your struggles also strengthens you for your assignments. The same grace that meets you in your weakness also positions you for supernatural breakthrough in every area of your life. Picture yourself waking up tomorrow morning, not just grateful for another chance to survive, but excited about another opportunity to see God's power demonstrated through your ordinary circumstances. Imagine approaching your biggest challenges not with dread but with anticipation, knowing that impossibilities are just opportunities for grace to be displayed. Envision yourself looking at the dreams you've carried for years, the goals you've abandoned because they seemed too difficult, the calling you've ignored because you felt unqualified, and suddenly seeing them through the lens of God's unlimited ability to work through available vessels. This isn't wishful thinking or motivational psychology. This is the reality that becomes accessible when you understand the full scope of what it means to be covered by God's grace. But here's something crucial that I need you to understand about operating in this level of grace. It requires a daily surrender that goes beyond just asking for help. It requires positioning yourself as a steward of whatever God chooses to do through your life, understanding that every blessing, every opportunity, every success is ultimately about His glory being displayed through your yielded existence. Think about Moses when God called him to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. Moses focused on his limitations, his speech impediment, his lack of credentials, his past failures. But God focused on His unlimited power, working through a surrendered life. The miracles that happened through Moses weren't about Moses' abilities. They were about God's power flowing through someone who was willing to be used. The same principle applies to your life today. When you position yourself under God's covering and make yourself available for His purposes, you're not volunteering your talents and abilities to help God accomplish His plans. You're surrendering yourself as a vessel through which His power can be demonstrated in ways that bring glory to His name and blessing to others. This understanding eliminates the pressure to be perfect or to have everything figured out before you step into what God is calling you to do. You don't have to wait until you feel qualified or prepared or equipped. You just have to be willing to be covered by grace, and then allow that grace to work through your availability. Let me tell you about James, a man who felt called to mentor young men in his community, but was intimidated because he had never been a father himself and didn't feel like he had much wisdom to offer. His own childhood had been difficult, marked by an absent father and a series of poor male role models. He worried that his past disqualified him from being able to help others. When James began positioning himself under God's covering each morning, something shifted in his perspective. Instead of focusing on what he lacked, he started focusing on what God could provide through him. Instead of seeing his difficult past as a disqualification, he began to see it as preparation for understanding the struggles these young men were facing. "Cover me with your grace, Lord. Give me wisdom beyond my experience. Help me to be the kind of mentor these young men need. Use my story, including the difficult parts, to bring hope and direction to their lives." James started with just one young man, a teenager from his neighborhood who was heading down a destructive path. He didn't have a formal program or curriculum. He just made himself available to listen, to encourage, and to share what he was learning about living under God's grace. That one relationship led to another, then another. Within 5 years, James was mentoring dozens of young men, and many of them were becoming mentors themselves. What started as one man's willingness to be covered by grace and used for God's purposes became a movement that transformed an entire community. But here's what James discovered in the process. When you allow grace to work through your availability, you don't just impact others. You experience a fulfillment and joy that comes from knowing you're living in alignment with God's purposes for your life. You discover that the greatest satisfaction doesn't come from receiving blessings, but from being used to bless others. This is what happens when you move beyond just asking God to your own needs and begin understanding cover you with His grace. For that, His covering is designed to position you as an agent of transformation in other people's lives. Now, as we dive even deeper into what this covering means, I want to share with you something that will completely transform how you approach not just your morning prayer, but every moment of your day. When you consistently live under the covering of God's grace, you develop what Scripture calls the mind of Christ. You begin to think the way Jesus thinks, to see situations the way He sees them, to respond to challenges the way He would respond. This isn't about becoming perfect or never making mistakes. This is about having access to divine perspective that enables you to navigate life's complexities with wisdom that transcends your natural understanding. Consider what happened to Linda, a single mother who was raising 3 teenagers while working 2 jobs and going to school herself to complete her nursing degree. Every day felt like a juggling act where one small mistake could cause everything to come crashing down. Linda was stressed, overwhelmed, and constantly worried that she was failing her children because she couldn't give them the time and attention she felt they deserved. She was exhausted from trying to be everything to everyone while maintaining perfect control over every detail of their lives. When Linda began positioning herself under God's covering each morning, asking Him to give her not just strength for the day, but His perspective on her circumstances, something remarkable began to happen. Instead of seeing her busy schedule as evidence of her inadequacy as a mother, she began to see it as an opportunity to model perseverance and determination for her children. Instead of viewing her financial struggles as failures, she started recognizing them as lessons in resourcefulness and gratitude. Instead of feeling guilty about not being able to attend every school event or provide every luxury other families enjoyed, she began to understand that her children were learning valuable lessons about priorities, sacrifice, and the importance of working toward goals. But the most significant change was in how Linda related to her teenagers. When she was operating from stress and guilt, she was constantly correcting, controlling, and critiquing their choices. But when she began to see them through eyes of grace, she started recognizing their potential, instead of just focusing on their problems. She began to speak to who they were becoming, rather than just addressing who they were in the moment. She started celebrating small victories, instead of only pointing out areas that needed improvement. She learned to trust God's work in their lives, instead of feeling like their success or failure was entirely dependent on her perfect parenting. The transformation in Linda's household was remarkable. Her children began to respond to her new approach with more respect and cooperation. They started making better choices, not because they were afraid of punishment, but because they could sense their mother's belief in their potential. But here's the most beautiful part of Linda's story. As her children grew older and left home, they often commented that the thing they remembered most about their childhood wasn't the things they didn't have, but the way their mother's faith and determination inspired them to believe they could overcome any obstacle they faced. Linda discovered that when you parent from under the covering of God's grace, you're not just raising children, you're raising future adults who understand that challenges are opportunities, that limitations can be transcended through faith, and that love is more powerful than any circumstance they might face. This is what happens when you allow grace to transform not just your personal struggles, but your approach to the relationships and responsibilities that matter most to you. But let me address something that might be stirring in your heart right now. Maybe you're thinking, these stories are inspiring, but my situation is different. My challenges are more complex. My past is messier. My current circumstances are more overwhelming. How do I know that this covering of grace will work for someone like me? Friend, that question reveals something beautiful about your heart. It shows that you're not looking for empty promises or superficial solutions. You want to know if this truth is real enough and powerful enough to handle the specific complexities of your actual life. And the answer is yes, absolutely yes. But not because grace is a formula that automatically makes everything easy. Grace works because it connects you to the unlimited resources of a God who specializes in impossible situations, who delights in demonstrating his power through people who have exhausted their own resources. The Apostle Paul understood this better than anyone. He wrote most eloquently about grace, but he also faced circumstances that would have crushed most people. He was beaten, imprisoned, shipwrecked, betrayed by friends, attacked by enemies, and constantly facing life-threatening situations. Yet Paul wrote from prison that he had learned to be content in all circumstances, whether he had plenty or was in need. He discovered that grace wasn't about God removing all challenges from his life. Grace was about God providing supernatural strength, wisdom, peace, and joy that enabled him to not just survive difficult circumstances, but to thrive in them. Paul's life demonstrated that when you're covered by grace, your circumstances don't determine your peace. Your peace determines how you navigate your circumstances. Your external situation doesn't define your internal reality. Your internal reality, anchored in God's unfailing love and unlimited power, gives you the ability to transform even the most difficult external situations. This is why people throughout history who have lived under the covering of God's grace have been able to maintain hope in hopeless situations, find strength in weakness, experience joy in sorrow, and discover purpose in pain. They understood that grace provides access to resources that transcend natural limitations. Now, as we near the end of our time together this morning, I want to leave you with something that will ensure that this isn't just another inspiring message you heard, but a life-changing encounter that transforms how you live every single day from this moment forward. Tomorrow morning, when you wake up and your feet hit the floor, you're going to have a choice. You can approach the day the same way you've approached countless other days, relying on your own strength, carrying your own burdens, trying to control your own outcomes. Or you can do something different. You can whisper those 3 simple words that have the power to change everything. Cover me with your grace, Lord. But I want you to understand that this isn't just a prayer to pray once and forget about. This is a way of life to embrace. This is a daily positioning of your heart that acknowledges your complete dependence on God and your total trust in His goodness. When you make this prayer routine, you're not just asking the foundation of your morning for a better day. You're positioning yourself for a transformed life. You're opening the door for heaven to invade your circumstances and demonstrate God's power through your surrendered availability. The stories I've shared with you today aren't exceptional experiences reserved for a select few super-spiritual individuals. They're examples of what becomes possible when ordinary people position themselves under the extraordinary covering of God's grace. You have the same access to this covering that every person in these stories had. Your past doesn't disqualify you. Your present circumstances don't limit you. Your future is not determined by your current resources or abilities, but by your willingness to be covered by the unlimited grace of a God who loves you more than you can comprehend. So as you prepare to step into this new way of living, Remember that grace isn't just about receiving blessings. Grace is about becoming a blessing. Grace isn't just about having your needs met. Grace is about becoming an instrument through which others' needs are met. Grace isn't just about experiencing transformation. Grace is about becoming a catalyst for transformation in the lives of everyone God brings across your path. This covering that you're about to step under isn't just for your personal benefit. It's positioning you to be part of God's strategy for bringing healing, hope, and restoration to a world that desperately needs to experience His love in tangible ways. When you understand this truth, everything about your prayer life shifts from maintenance to multiplication. You're no longer just asking God to help you get through another day. You're positioning yourself to be part of His divine strategy for transforming the spiritual atmosphere of every place your feet touch. Let me paint you a picture of what this looks like in practical terms. Imagine walking into your workplace, not wondering if you'll have the strength to deal with difficult co-workers, but knowing that grace is going before you to prepare divine encounters. Picture yourself entering that challenging family situation, not dreading the conflict, but anticipating how God's wisdom will flow through your words to bring peace where there's been division. Envision yourself facing that financial crisis, not consumed with worry about how you'll make it through, but expectant that the same God who multiplied loaves and fishes has strategies for provision that you haven't even considered yet. This is what happens when grace covers every dimension of your existence. But here's something most people never discover about this covering. When you live under it consistently, you begin to develop what I call prophetic sensitivity. You start sensing things in the spirit before they manifest in the natural. You begin to recognize God's voice in situations where others only hear noise. You develop the ability to discern what God is doing in circumstances where others only see chaos. This sensitivity isn't reserved for pastors or professional ministers. It's available to every believer who positions themselves under God's covering and learns to live from that place of surrender and trust. You become someone who can sense when breakthrough is coming before any evidence appears in the natural realm. Consider what happened to David, a real estate agent who had been struggling for months without making a single sale. The market was tough, competition was fierce, and his confidence was completely shattered. He was on the verge of giving up and finding a different career when someone shared this prayer with him. David began each morning by positioning himself under God's covering, but he didn't just pray for sales. He prayed for divine appointments, for favor with clients, for wisdom to serve people in ways that would genuinely bless their lives. He asked God to use him as an instrument of peace in transactions that are often stressful and contentious. Within weeks, David began to notice something remarkable. He started sensing things about potential clients that weren't obvious from their surface conversation. He would know when someone was feeling pressured or anxious, and he would respond with patience and understanding. That put them at ease. He could discern when a property wasn't right for a family, even when they thought they wanted it, and his guidance saved them from costly mistakes. But the most extraordinary thing was David's ability to connect people with properties in ways that seemed almost supernatural. He would walk into a house and immediately know which client it was perfect for, even when the logical match didn't make sense on paper. Time after time, he would show homes to people who fell in love instantly because something in his spirit had directed him to the perfect fit. David's business didn't just recover, it exploded. But more importantly, he discovered that when you operate under the covering of grace, your work becomes ministry. Every transaction became an opportunity to demonstrate God's love, wisdom, and faithfulness to people who were making one of the biggest decisions of their lives. The testimonials David received weren't just about his professional competence. They were about the peace clients felt in his presence, the wisdom they received through his counsel, and the sense that their real estate agent actually cared more about their well-being than his commission. This is what happens when you understand that grace doesn't just change your circumstances. Grace changes your capacity to impact others' circumstances. You become someone through whom heaven touches earth in the most ordinary situations. But let me share something with you that will revolutionize how you think about the scope of this covering. When you consistently position yourself under God's grace, you don't just receive individual blessing. You become part of a spiritual network that's advancing God's kingdom throughout the earth. Think about it this way. Every person who genuinely surrenders to this covering becomes a node in heaven's communication system. You become someone through whom God can orchestrate divine connections, miraculous provisions, and supernatural interventions that affect not just your immediate circle, but people you may never meet this side of eternity. I remember talking to Susan, a woman who had been praying this prayer faithfully for over a year. She told me about a morning when she felt impressed to take a different route to work, even though it would make her late for an important meeting. She almost ignored the impression because it didn't make logical sense, but something in her spirit insisted this was important. On that alternate route, Susan encountered a car accident that had just happened. A young mother with 2 small children was trapped in her vehicle, and the emergency responders hadn't arrived yet. Susan, who had taken first aid training years earlier, was able to provide crucial assistance until paramedics arrived. Later, Susan learned that the woman she helped was the wife of a missionary who was preparing to leave for a dangerous assignment overseas. The accident could have been fatal, but because Susan was sensitive to the Holy Spirit's leading and willing to obey, even when it cost her something, a family was preserved and a mission field remained served. Susan had no way of knowing the eternal significance of her obedience in that moment. She was simply living under the covering of grace and remaining sensitive to divine promptings. But her willingness to be led by the Spirit became part of God's strategy for advancing His kingdom in a remote part of the world she'll probably never visit. This is what happens when you understand that your personal covering of grace connects you to God's global purposes. Every act of obedience, every moment of sensitivity to His voice, every willingness to be inconvenienced for the sake of others becomes part of a tapestry that's much larger than you can see. But here's where this truth becomes absolutely transformational for how you approach each new day. When you wake up tomorrow morning and whisper, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," you're not just positioning yourself for personal blessing. You're volunteering to be part of whatever God wants to accomplish in the earth that day. You're saying, "Use me, lead me, speak through me, love through me, demonstrate your power through my surrendered availability." You're positioning yourself as a co-laborer with Christ in the ministry of reconciliation that restores broken relationships, heals wounded hearts, and demonstrates heaven's reality to people who have lost hope. This understanding eliminates the boredom and purposelessness that plague so many believers. When you realize that every conversation could be a divine appointment, every challenge could be an opportunity for grace to be displayed, every ordinary moment could be pregnant with eternal significance, life becomes an adventure of faith rather than a routine of survival. Let me tell you about Mark, a janitor who worked the night shift at a large office building. For years, he had viewed his job as simply a means to pay bills, something he endured rather than enjoyed. He felt invisible, unimportant, like his work didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. When Mark began positioning himself under God's covering each night before work, asking to be used as an instrument of blessing, even in his humble role, something began to shift in his perspective. Instead of just cleaning offices, he started praying over the workspaces of people who would occupy them the next day. He began to notice personal items on desks that revealed struggles people were facing. Family photos that spoke of relationships, prescription bottles that indicated health challenges, motivational quotes that suggested someone was fighting discouragement. Mark started praying specifically for these individuals, asking God to bless their work, their families, their health, their dreams. But grace began to orchestrate encounters that went beyond just prayer. Mark started finding opportunities to encourage people who worked late, to offer assistance to employees who were struggling with heavy loads, to provide a listening ear for security guards who were dealing with personal problems. Word began to spread throughout the building that the night janitor was someone special, someone who genuinely cared about people and had a way of showing up at exactly the right moment with exactly the right word of encouragement. Executives who had never noticed Mark before began to seek him out for advice and prayer. The transformation was so remarkable that the building management began to receive comments about the positive atmosphere that seemed to permeate the entire facility. Productivity increased, employee satisfaction surveys improved, and conflicts between departments decreased significantly. What was happening? Grace was using one surrendered janitor to transform the spiritual climate of an entire office building. Mark's willingness to be covered by grace and used for God's purposes became a catalyst for blessing hundreds of people who had no idea why their work environment had become so much more pleasant and peaceful. This is the kind of impact that becomes possible when you understand that grace doesn't just bless you individually. Grace flows through you to bless everyone within your sphere of influence. Your family experiences it, your co-workers benefit from it, your community is transformed by it. But now I want to share something with you that will take your understanding of this covering to its ultimate level. When you live under the covering of God's grace consistently and allow it to flow through you to others, you begin to participate in what Scripture calls the fellowship of His sufferings. This doesn't mean you're going to suffer more than other people. It means you're going to understand suffering differently than other people. Instead of seeing pain and difficulty as evidence that God has abandoned you, you'll begin to recognize them as opportunities for grace to be displayed in even greater measure. You'll discover that some of your most powerful ministry happens not when everything is going well, but when you're walking through valleys and still maintaining faith, hope, and love. People are drawn to authenticity, and there's something incredibly compelling about someone who can maintain peace in chaos, hope in difficulty, and joy in sorrow. Think about Paul and Silas in the Philippian jail. They had been beaten, falsely accused, and thrown into prison for preaching the gospel. By all natural reasoning, they should have been discouraged, angry, and ready to quit. Instead, they were singing praises to God at midnight, and their response to adversity became the catalyst for the jailer and his entire family to come to faith. Their willingness to maintain worship in the midst of suffering didn't just impact their own situation. It transformed the spiritual atmosphere of the entire prison and led to multiple salvations. That's what happens when grace covers you so completely that even your responses to difficulty become testimonies of God's goodness. I think about Margaret, a woman who was diagnosed with cancer just months after she began praying this prayer daily. Her first reaction was to wonder if she had done something wrong, if her faith wasn't strong enough, if God hadn't really heard her prayers for covering and protection. But as Margaret continued to position herself under God's grace throughout her treatment, something extraordinary began to happen. Instead of the cancer journey becoming a season of despair and fear, it became a platform for grace to be displayed in ways she never could have imagined. Margaret's oncology appointments became opportunities to pray for other patients and their families. Her hospital stays became chances to encourage nurses and doctors who were dealing with their own struggles. Her chemotherapy sessions became times of fellowship with other cancer patients who found hope and strength in her unwavering faith. The transformation in Margaret's approach to her illness had such a profound impact that the Cancer Center asked her to become a volunteer counselor for newly diagnosed patients. Her willingness to allow grace to cover even her suffering became a source of healing for dozens of other people who were walking similar paths. But here's the most beautiful part of Margaret's story. She later said that the cancer, which she initially saw as evidence that her prayers weren't working, actually became the very avenue through which her prayers were answered in ways she never could have anticipated. She had asked God to use her life to bless others, and He did exactly that through circumstances she wouldn't have chosen, but came to treasure because of their eternal impact. This is what happens when you understand that grace doesn't always prevent suffering, but it always provides purpose for suffering. It transforms your pain into a platform, your struggle into a strength, your test into a testimony that demonstrates God's faithfulness to others who are facing similar challenges. As we begin to wrap up our time together this morning, I want you to understand that everything I've shared with you isn't theoretical knowledge to be admired. It's practical truth to be applied. The stories you've heard aren't exceptional experiences to be envied. They're examples of what becomes available to anyone who makes the decision to position themselves under the covering of God's grace and live from that place of surrender and trust. Tomorrow morning, when that alarm sounds and consciousness returns, you're going to have an opportunity to step into a completely different way of living, not because your circumstances will automatically change, but because your perspective on your circumstances will be transformed. You'll wake up not wondering if you have what it takes to face another day, but knowing that the same grace that has carried you this far will provide everything you need for whatever lies ahead. You'll approach your responsibilities not as overwhelming burdens to be endured, but as opportunities for grace to be demonstrated through your surrendered availability. You'll enter into relationships not wondering if you'll have the wisdom and patience you need, but confident that grace will provide supernatural love, understanding and forgiveness that transcends your natural limitations. You'll face challenges not with dread about potential outcomes, but with anticipation about how God's power will be revealed through impossible situations. But most importantly, you'll live each day with the awareness that your life matters in ways you may never fully understand this side of eternity. Every prayer you pray, every act of kindness you perform, every word of encouragement you speak, every moment of faithfulness you display becomes part of God's strategy for advancing His kingdom and demonstrating His love to a world that desperately needs to experience His goodness. The covering of grace you step under tomorrow morning doesn't just protect and provide for you. It positions you as an agent of transformation in every sphere of influence where God has placed you. Your family, your workplace, your community, your nation all become candidates for breakthrough when you learn to live under this covering and allow it to flow through you to others. This isn't about becoming perfect or pretending you don't have struggles. This is about discovering that when you position yourself under God's covering, your struggles become platforms for His strength to be displayed. Your weaknesses become opportunities for His power to be perfected. Your humanity becomes a vessel through which His divinity can touch others who need to experience His love. So as you prepare to leave this place and step into the rest of your day, carry with you the understanding that grace isn't just something you receive. Grace is something you become, not through your own effort or determination, but through your willingness to be covered by God's unmerited favor, and then allow that favor to transform everything about how you see yourself, your circumstances, and your purpose. The prayer, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," isn't just a request for blessing, it's a declaration of dependence. It's an acknowledgement of need. It's a positioning for purpose. It's an invitation for heaven to invade your ordinary moments and make them extraordinary opportunities for God's goodness to be revealed. And when you pray those words tomorrow morning, remember that you're not just asking for a better day. You're stepping into a better way of living, a way that's marked by peace instead of anxiety, hope instead of despair, love instead of fear, a way that transforms not just your experience, but the experience of everyone whose life intersects with yours. The covering is available, the grace is ready, the transformation is waiting. All that remains is your willingness to whisper those three simple words and then live in the reality of what they release. Cover me with your grace, Lord. And when you step into tomorrow with this understanding, something beautiful begins to unfold in the most unexpected places. You'll find yourself in conversations that seem ordinary on the surface, but underneath, grace is orchestrating divine encounters that will leave lasting impact on hearts that have been waiting for just the right word at just the right moment. Let me tell you about Catherine, a cashier at a busy grocery store who felt like her job was meaningless repetition. Day after day, she would scan items, process payments, and say, "Have a nice day," to hundreds of customers who barely acknowledged her existence. She felt invisible, unimportant, like she was just going through the motions of life without any real purpose or significance. But when Catherine began positioning herself under God's covering each morning before work, asking Him to use her even in her humble role, something extraordinary started happening. Instead of just seeing groceries and credit cards, she began to see people. Real people with real struggles, real hopes, real needs that were often written all over their faces if you knew how to look. The elderly man buying single-serving meals wasn't just a customer. He was someone who was probably lonely and might need a kind word. The young mother with crying children and a cart full of baby formula wasn't just holding up the line. She was someone who was overwhelmed and could use patience and encouragement. The teenager buying energy drinks and junk food wasn't just making poor choices. He was probably struggling with something and needed someone to see his value. Catherine started doing small things that made a big difference. She would take an extra moment to really look people in the eyes when she spoke to them. She would offer genuine compliments when she noticed something positive. She would ask how someone's day was going and actually listen to the answer. She would pray silently for customers while she was scanning their items, asking God to bless their homes, their families, their struggles. But grace began to orchestrate encounters that went far beyond pleasant customer service. Catherine found herself in conversations with people who were going through divorces, dealing with sick children, facing financial crises, struggling with depression. Somehow, in the span of a few minutes while groceries were being bagged, these individuals would open up about their deepest struggles to this cashier, who radiated something they couldn't quite identify but desperately needed. Word began to spread through the community that there was something special about the cashier in Lane 7. People would specifically choose Catherine's line, even when it was longer than others, because they could sense that she genuinely cared about them as human beings. Customers started bringing her cards, letters, small gifts, thanking her for the impact she was having on their lives. The store manager began to notice that customer satisfaction surveys consistently mentioned Catherine's exceptional service, but more than that, they mentioned how she made people feel valued, heard, and cared for. What started as one woman positioning herself under God's covering became a transformation of the entire atmosphere of that grocery store. But here's what Catherine discovered that changed everything about how she understood her purpose. She realized that God hadn't placed her in that grocery store job as a temporary inconvenience until something better came along. He had positioned her there as a strategic assignment, a place where she could touch hundreds of lives every single week with the same grace that was covering her. Catherine learned that there are no insignificant assignments when you're operating under the covering of God's grace. Every role, every responsibility, every ordinary interaction becomes an opportunity for heaven to demonstrate its reality through your surrendered availability. This is what happens when you stop seeing your current circumstances as obstacles to your purpose and start recognizing them as the very platform where your purpose is meant to be fulfilled. Grace doesn't just change what you do, it transforms why you do it and how you do it. Now let me address something that might be stirring in your heart as you hear these stories. Maybe you're thinking, these transformations sound wonderful, but what about when grace doesn't seem to change the external circumstances? What about when you're praying for covering but the bills are still unpaid, the relationships are still broken, the health issues are still there? This is perhaps the most important aspect of grace that you need to understand. Grace doesn't always change your circumstances immediately, but it always changes your capacity to handle your circumstances supernaturally. Grace doesn't promise that every storm will be stopped, but it guarantees that you'll have divine strength to walk through every storm with peace, purpose, and unshakable confidence in God's goodness. Think about the 3 Hebrew boys in the fiery furnace. God didn't prevent them from being thrown into the fire, but He joined them in the flames and protected them so completely that they came out without even the smell of smoke on their clothing. The miracle wasn't that they avoided the trial. The miracle was that they experienced God's presence and protection in the middle of the trial. That's exactly how grace operates in your life. Sometimes God delivers you from difficult situations, and sometimes He delivers you through difficult situations. But in both cases, you experience His covering in ways that demonstrate His faithfulness and build your testimony of His goodness. I remember talking to Jonathan, a construction worker who had been out of work for 8 months despite praying daily for God's covering and provision. His savings were exhausted, his credit cards were maxed out, and he was facing the possibility of losing his home. Every morning, he would position himself under God's grace, but the phone wasn't ringing with job offers, and the bills kept piling up. Jonathan was beginning to wonder if his prayers were being heard, if he was doing something wrong, if God really cared about his practical needs. The pressure was overwhelming, and he was starting to feel like giving up on faith altogether. Then one morning, as Jonathan was praying his usual prayer for covering, something shifted in his heart. Instead of focusing on what wasn't happening, he began to focus on what was happening. He realized that despite the financial stress, he still had peace in his heart. Despite the uncertainty about the future, he still had hope. Despite the pressure from every direction, he still had strength to keep believing. Jonathan began to understand that grace wasn't just about getting the job he needed. Grace was about having supernatural peace while he waited for the job. Grace wasn't just about paying the bills on time. Grace was about maintaining faith when the bills couldn't be paid. Grace wasn't just about avoiding difficulty. Grace was about experiencing God's presence and provision in the middle of difficulty. Friend, as we close this morning together, I want you to carry this truth deep in your heart. When you whisper, "Cover me with your grace, Lord," tomorrow morning, you're not just saying a prayer, you're stepping into your divine destiny. You're positioning yourself to be transformed from the inside out and to become a transforming presence in this world. The covering is real, the grace is available, and your breakthrough begins the moment you surrender to His perfect love. God bless you.